Hi, everybody. Our next topic here that we're looking at is Chapter 11 related to human development or developmental psychology. We'll look a little bit at our developmental journey all the way from prenatal growth into late adulthood and end of life, looking at childhood and adolescence and adulthood, all of those different great ages that we go through. And this is a whole branch of psychology, right? Either lifespan psychology or sometimes developmental psychology or human development. It's a branch that studies all of the physical, cognitive, and social changes that we make throughout our lifespan. So kind of looking at what are some of the big milestones that we go through, along with trying to understand why we change and how we change, and all of the kind of norms for each age range that we progress through from before we're even born all the way to old age, and even through death. So let's start at the beginning, right? The beginning of a new cell, which is the moment of conception. Conception occurs when a single sperm cell from a male penetrates the outer coating of an egg or a cell from a female, and they fuse together to make one new fertilized cell, right? And we aren't technically pregnant yet at the moment of conception. When egg and sperm meet in the fallopian tube, typically, it then has to travel all the way down through the fallopian tubes to the uterine wall, implant into the uterine wall. And at that point, a person is pregnant and they begin that long prenatal journey that they'll go through of development over the course of roughly 9 months. And really wild to look at pictures of prenatal development. We go from looking very like alien-like and super small to being roughly the size of like a watermelon, about 7 to 9 pounds by the time we're born. And we progress through a couple of different like terms and stages of development. Right off the bat, that new fertilized cell is called a zygote. Rapidly dividing cell takes about a week to complete some of the divisions that it goes through, and then it becomes a blastocyst. A blastocyst is the next stage. That's the part that's going to implant into the uterine wall. We are an embryo from the point of there all the way to about 3 months. So the first 3 months or first trimester of pregnancy, we're technically known as an embryo. And then we become a fetus, which is Latin for offspring or young one. And that's from about 10 weeks all the way into the point where we are born. And you can see here just some of the changes that we go through in these images, from being about the size of like the pin of like the head of a pin, like tiny, tiny, tiny little speck, to again being like roughly like 7 to 9 pounds by the time that we're born, roughly 9 months later. Pregnancy, right, the technical term for the carrying of a fetus or an offspring inside the womb or the uterus, typically broken into 3 periods of time, right? So we have semesters for a school year, or we have trimesters, which are 3 periods of about 3 months or 13 weeks each. And during the course of pregnancy, obviously everything that a woman puts into their body is going directly to that fetus, right? Which is why there are so many rules, because the placenta is the organ that connects the fetus to the uterine wall, and everything that that person puts into their body goes to the baby, including teratogens or any kind of toxic agent, which is why you're not supposed to do things like drink alcohol or use certain substances. You're supposed to be careful with the amount of caffeine and certain things like deli meats and so on, right? All of that stuff can be somewhat harmful to a baby, especially if consumed in excess. So pregnancy in general is most likely to have a favorable outcome when the person carrying the baby, when the mother has good nutrition, good medical care, they avoid exposing that fetus to any kind of harmful substance, and they're going for regular checks with their OBGYN. They're seeing their doctor, having ultrasounds, and everything is being very closely monitored. So after roughly like 40 weeks or so, roughly 3 trimesters or 9 months, we hit a point of having a newborn baby. So prenatal means before birth, and then we have a neonate, right? So after roughly 9 months or so, a little baby or babies are born. I have twins, so sometimes it's more than one. Thank goodness it wasn't way more than one, right? It could have had eight. But a neonate is a newborn baby. And newborns come equipped with a number of like useful reflexes to help them survive. Now, obviously, a newborn is completely dependent on their caregiver in order to survive, but they do have a couple of little reflexes which are crucial and critical to their life outside of the uterus. So when newborn baby, like while they can't do a whole lot, they do have some reflexes, like a rooting reflex. Well, they'll turn their head toward anything that touches their cheek. So this is one way that you can get them to turn toward a bottle or a breast to be fed. They'll turn toward any kind of touch on their cheek. They know to suck anything that enters the mouth and then swallow any kind of liquid or fluid that comes into their mouth. Babies also have a very strong grasping reflex. Who knew that babies would be so strong, but they can really grip very tightly onto a finger or onto an item. They also do like this stepping reflex with their feet, which is kind of a precursor to walking, or at least that's the thought. And then they have a Moro reflex, which is kind of an interesting one to see. Like anytime there's a really loud noise or if a baby feels like they're falling, they'll kind of fan their hands out like this and then pull them back in toward themselves. So these are all probably some kind of precursor to a later behavior, but they're little things that are critical to life outside the uterus, especially the like rooting, sucking, swallowing, and some of the things related to feeding. Now, as we're born, we obviously start this long process now of growing and developing. Really, really important to have a lot of stimulation during childhood, right? And make sure that babies have tons of variety in the things that they're exposed to. Their brain and all of like their neurological development is just flourishing in those first years of life. So really important to have a lot of stimulation to increase that neural growth. What we see is that babies follow a very like set pattern, which we can call maturation. It's this biological growth process that enables very orderly changes in behavior, and they're relatively uninfluenced by experience. And so what we can see, for example, like with motor development, is babies first will sit up, and then they crawl, and then they walk, right? They kind of follow this like unfolding or maturation process that they go through. And while we tend to see some variance in when they do that, we don't see a lot of variance in the order in which they do it. So not only are we growing our brain, we're doing all sorts of incredible amount of like picking up language, taking in the world around us. All of those connections are flourishing, but we see a lot of motor development in the first like year and a half of life. A newborn baby, if you put them on a bed and walk away, not that I'm saying to do this, but if you did that, they would be right there when you came back, right? They can't really move a whole lot. Eventually, they start to kind of do little push-ups and then they roll over. Then somewhere around 6 months or so, they'll start sitting up. Once they can sit up and support their weight, that changes the foods that they eat. Oh, I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me, right? It changes the foods that they start eating. They do a little bit more solid food, which then helps them to start crawling. Somewhere around a year, they start to cruise, which is when they hold on to little things and like walk around them, and then typically can walk independently somewhere between 12 to 15 months on average. So again, there's lots of developmental averages, and some are a little faster or slower, but we don't change too much in the sequence in which we do things. We also see that there's an incredible amount of cognitive development that happens in babies, right? This is like the most disturbing like graphic of people down here, right? Especially this one, right? But I made myself laugh. But Jean Piaget, one of the most famous psychologists for cognitive development, talked a lot about how our brain changes and grows as we are getting older. And he developed what he called 4 different cognitive stages: the sensory motor stage, pre-operational stage, concrete operational, and formal operational. And that at each stage, we kind of have hallmark things that we're learning, ways of interacting with and thinking about the world. So let's go through each one of those 4 stages. The first one, the sensory motor stage, happens when we're roughly like 0 to 2 years old. So the first 2 years of life. And in this stage, babies are taking everything in, right? They're little sponges soaking up the world by looking, hearing, touching, mouthing, and grasping. Babies love to put everything in their mouth at this stage, right? And touch everything. And one thing that we notice in the sensory motor stage is that babies lack something called object permanence. Objects that are out of sight are also out of mind. And this is a fun one. This is why peekaboo is such a fun game with a young child. When you go like this, you have disappeared from the world. And so when you reveal yourself, you've magically appeared, and they will laugh and squeal and giggle. or even be slightly frightened that you just appeared out of nowhere. They don't understand that you are still there. You're just hiding behind this, right? Or if you put a blanket over something, it's still there. So out of sight and out of mind is a very common thing that we see in young children. Just kind of one hallmark thing that you see in each one of these stages. In the pre-operational stage, which is 2 to 7 years of age, children are kind of before the ability to perform complex mental operations. Now, Piaget would say that children at this age are very egocentric, and having raised three little girls, I can tell you this is so true. They aren't able to see anything from another person's point of view. It's like my way or the highway. If they're hungry, you're hungry. If they're tired, you're tired. Everything about their reality is your reality. They're not really able to put themselves into another person's shoes yet, kind of lacking a little bit of that empathy and perspective, right? They're still just too young. They're pre-operational in those years between like 2 to 7. In the concrete operational stage, we're looking at like 7 to 11 years of age. At this age, they start to get a little bit more concrete. They're thinking about the world in very like black and white terms. Everything is very absolute. And they learn a skill called conservation, kind of an interesting little test that you can see, and it's been done a ton in like human development studies. But if you had two containers with liquid in it and you poured it into a different container, someone who doesn't have conservation would be tricked by the size and shape of the container. Someone who has conservation, who's in this stage, would understand that, oh, you just poured it into another container, and so of course it's the same. Right. So what we see is that children are starting to think about the world in a little bit more like concrete kind of terms. It's very limited, right? They're able to kind of take somebody else's point of view, but it's starting to be learned, right? It's something that's still kind of in its infancy. The last stage that Piaget talked about was the formal operational stage that starts around 12. And according to him, in this stage, we're able to go from very concrete, absolute thinking to more abstract thinking. We can use symbols and imagined realities. We can kind of think about the world in very different terms. Right. In general, like we're kind of being able to formulate hypotheses and reject or accept them based on the outcome of experiments. We can understand cause and effect. We develop our own rules and theories about the world around us. We're starting to be able to think more abstractly. And then we just continue to develop this all the way through the teens and then into our adult years. We also go through an incredible amount of social development during childhood, starting with a very important emotional bond called attachment. In the first year of life, as babies start to be able to crawl and walk, they venture away from their caregivers and then they come back to them. And they develop this relationship that we can call attachment, where they're kind of going back and forth between sources of security and independence. And they can become securely attached or insecurely attached. There's a bunch of different types of attachment. But this emotional bond is really thought to set the stage for relationships and friendships and romantic connections later in life, right? That initial relationship with a parent, that emotional bond that you have with them kind of sets that stage. We also see a lot of socialization, learning the attitudes and behaviors appropriate to your family and culture, right? As you're going to school for the first time and interacting with friends, you start to learn the things that are okay and not okay, right? We start to pick those things up in our environment. So a lot of social development as we go through the childhood years, learning kind of the rules and norms of our cultures. We're also developing our gender, right? So when we're born, our sex is in place. Our sex is our biology, whether we're male or female or other. But by about the age of 3 or so, children are starting to develop a gender identity. This is their perception of being like masculine or feminine, or in the very early stages of being like, I'm a little boy or I'm a little girl, right? And they start to develop this like gender role awareness, kind of what's expected for males and females in their society. And a lot of this comes from parents and from teachers and also from the media, right? When you're watching shows and all of the men wear certain clothes or have certain roles, or all of the women do certain things or use makeup or do certain like activities, These are things that children are soaking in, and it starts to kind of shape the way that they view masculinity and femininity and their gender role awareness and identity from a very, very young age. Now, it's not very common at a young age that children feel other than their kind of sex. Sex and gender are usually very similar when they're very young, but this might change a little bit as they get older and start to develop more of a concrete identity. As we continue to age, teenagers all of a sudden, right? Roughly the ages of 10 to 20. I have three preteen girls right now, 11 and 13, or I guess teenage girls, right? So I'm right in the heart of this stage. But this is a period of life where someone is transitioning from being a child to being an adult. And this starts with the physical beginnings of sexual maturity with puberty, and then it ends with the achievement of independent adult status, right? So puberty typically start around 11 years old or so in females and closer to like 12 or 13 in males, a little bit later. It tends to start with the onset of a menstrual cycle. We see a lot of changes happening from hormones. Growth spurts where it is their people's height and weight starts to shoot up, their body starts to change a little bit, voice starting to deepen, body hair starting to develop. All of these things come with this period of adolescence or puberty, where we start to have these changes happening physically, which then lead to emotional changes as well. You'll be looking at these in the discussion this week. You'll be getting your country music fix in the discussion this week related to human development. We also see a lot of sexual characteristics developing during adolescence, right? The primary sex characteristics develop rapidly. These are your reproductive organs and external genitalia. And then the secondary sex characteristics, such as breasts and hips and facial hair, deepening voice, all of these things are starting to change as those hormonal influences are running rampant during this period of time, during adolescence. We also see a lot of cognitive development happening during the teenage years, right? You start to shift again in the way that you view the world. And teenagers are very concerned about what other people think of them, right? And some of us never outgrow this, but it's definitely a hallmark of the teenage years. Two very common fallacies that we see are imaginary audience and personal fable. Imaginary audience is this delusion of sorts that you're constantly being observed by others. It's like the spotlight is on you, you're on the stage, everyone is looking at you. That little blemish on your face, everyone sees it. Your bad hair day, everyone's talking about it, right? And the funny thing is because everyone is so worried that everyone is staring at them, no one's really looking at anybody at this period of time, but it is a very, very common delusion in the teenage years. We also have this idea of the personal fable, that we're unique and important and invulnerable, that nothing bad can happen to us, that we are kind of like safe and important and invulnerable in the world. And both of these things are just common cognitive development elements that happen to us when we're in the teenage years. Another thing that we see a lot of, and we've kind of been talking about this, but forming an identity. One of the big developmental tasks of the teen years is identity, right? Figuring out a stable sense of self. And this is a fun one, right? Right. You're trying to figure out like, what do I want to look like? What do I want to do when I grow up? How do I like to dress? How do I want my hair to be? What are the things that are important to me? What kind of music do I like, right? All of this is kind of trying on different selves before settling into a consistent and comfortable, stable sense of who you are. And this can, of course, change as you progress into your like teens and then into your 20s and 30s and so on. But most of us start to form like a fairly stable sense of ourself and identity in the teenage years. And this is kind of the big developmental task, if you will, of that period of time. As we enter into like the 18 to 25 range, that kind of early adulthood, emerging adulthood, during this time, oftentimes this is a big focus of like college or working, right? People get jobs for the first time. They might still be living with their parents or starting to move out, right? Attending college, working, or both. The main developmental concern of emerging adulthood is intimacy. So we went from identity, we figure out who we are, and now we go to intimacy, forming close, loving relationships. On average, Most people will like find somebody and fall in love with them in their late teens to early 20s. Really common to get married or enter into a committed relationship in your mid 20s, right? And this is something that's kind of like gone changed a little bit over time. We tend to see as well, right? But this is the big focus of emerging adulthood: falling in love, attending college, going to work, kind of solidifying that identity that you formed in the late teen years. In adulthood, we spend a lot of time on love, partnerships, parenting, and work, right? Tends to be a big focus of the adult years. Nearly all adults form long-term loving partnerships at some point in their life. Not everybody will form a long-term relationship or get married or be in a committed relationship, but for many people, loving and being loved by another person, having children and becoming a parent becomes an unparalleled source of fulfillment. We also see that work plays a huge role. Happiness in your job stems from working a job that fits your interests and provides you with a sense of competence and accomplishment. Also, if it pays you well, right? So, how much money you make, how much you like your job, how much sense of accomplishment it gives you, all of these things here on this slide can determine your happiness as you progress through the adult years. We also start to experience some physical changes, right? As we get closer to like our 40s and 50s, muscle strength, reaction time, and sensory abilities all start to decline. Sadly, they start to decline right around your mid 20s, which is why if you look at like Olympians, almost always they're like way younger, like teenage years or early 20s, because starting mid 20s or so, we start a very slow, steady decline. And obviously, how you take care of yourself and the level of activity you have plays a big part in this. Around 50 or so, we see that women start to go through something called menopause, right? A time of natural stopping or cessation of menstruation. It's the changes that occur for them, no longer able to reproduce as easily or maybe needing a little more assistance. I have this joke here with hot flashes that tends to be a very common like physical effect of menopause as people have all these hormonal changes that are occurring. Men do also experience some decrease in their hormones and fertility, which we can call andropause, but it's much more slight and much more gradual. We do tend to see for women that some women this can be pretty profound and like impacting, and for others, really minimal, kind of all over the place. But there are a lot of physical changes that occur as people enter into midlife. Cognitive changes also start to occur. We see that fluid intelligence, or your ability to reason quickly and speedily, starts to decline, right? So your ability to kind of react to things quickly and reason quickly declines a little bit. But your crystalline intelligence, which we can think of as like your wisdom, starts to go up. As you've had more life knowledge and accumulated skills, that rises, even though the other goes down a little bit. So a little bit of a balance. We gain vocabulary and knowledge, but we do lose a little bit of our memory and we tend to process a little bit slowly. But again, this is all dependent on how well you take care of yourself. If you get good sleep and you have a good diet and you stay mentally active and socially active, these things can be very, very slight. And if you don't do those things, they can obviously be a little bit more profound. In mid-adulthood, we tend to see a couple of things that happen. The stereotype is the midlife crisis, right? A time when somebody makes this like huge shift. They go out and buy a sports car, they divorce their partner of years, they change jobs. It's something really dramatic and drastic. That's actually more of a stereotype. What we tend to see way more frequently is a midlife transition where people kind of pause and they evaluate, like, oh, I'm in my 40s or my 50s. I have this amount of time probably left. What have I done and what would I still like to do? Kind of evaluating and formulating new goals. That's much, much more common than a midlife crisis. Though, of course, you always hear about the midlife crises in the media because they're much more dramatic. But this tends to be a period of time where people might pause for a minute and kind of have an awareness of the clock of their life and maybe start to reflect on what they want to change moving forward, if anything. As we get into late adulthood, we tend to have a very negative view of aging in our culture. And again, something this you're going to look at this week in your discussion related to this topic. But we often think of older adults as lonely, poor, ill, or senile, right? When in reality, the majority of people over 65 are pretty healthy, productive, and able, right? And I don't know if it's just because I'm getting older, right? I'm in my 40s, but I used to have such a negative view of people who are older. And now I look around me and I see people in their 60s and 70s who are still so sharp and doing everything that they want to do. And it gives me so much hope and encouragement. We do have a lot of physical changes that happen as we age, but it's not as bad as I think we tend to typically make it out as, especially if you take good care of yourself. Physical changes that happen as we get older, our hair turns a little bit thinner and often gray or white. Our skin will start to wrinkle a little bit, depending on how well you've taken care of it over the years. Our posture can change. We tend to shrink a little bit. I remember as a kid, we would measure my brother and I getting taller and our grandma getting shorter. And I remember the point where we kind of passed each other on that little growth chart. Our senses can dull a little bit. Our reaction times get a little bit slower. So we do have some physical changes, but some of these things are so slight that you might barely notice them. And your attitude matters so much, right? You tend to only be as old as you feel. A couple other things that we see in late adulthood. Socially, one big hallmark of late adulthood is retirement. Most people work the vast majority of their adult life. And when we get into our mid 60s or maybe even like very early 70s, a lot of people choose to retire from their job. They see it as a time to slow down, to do a little less, to explore new possibilities, to travel, to take on hobbies and new like tasks and things that you didn't have time for before. We also see cognitive changes continuing into late adulthood. Healthy people who remain intellectually active tend to maintain a high level of functioning in older age. Now, there are some cognitive disorders that tend to affect people in their late years, much more than people who are younger. For example, Alzheimer's or Lewy body dementia. There's a couple of different very common dementias that can happen when we get older. But again, these are very dependent on how well you take care of yourself. They're neurological disorders most likely found after the age of 65. They are characterized by changes in memory and cognition and personality, but you're by no means doomed to get one of these. They affect like about 1 in 10 people. And again, how well you've taken care of yourself throughout your life tends to play a big role in like a protective factor. As we get toward the end of life, definitely some research on facing the end. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, well known for her 5 stages that people pass through as they react to their own impending death or the idea of their impending death. And this doesn't necessarily have to be late adulthood that you're going through this, but most of us hope that we make it way late into adulthood and we're thinking about these things in our 80s or so on. But as we think about the idea of death, we tend to go through 5 distinct stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, right? And denial is where most of us are the vast majority of our younger life. Like, oh, that's going to happen one day. I don't need to think about it. That's not me. Anger, like, so maybe you get a terminal diagnosis, or as you're getting closer to the end of life, being angry about it, leading to bargaining. Like, I'll become religious, I'll start going to the gym, I'll do X if only Y, right? Kind of trying to bargain with a higher power. Depression, right? Feeling sad about it, right? Like kind of succumbing to the sadness of it. And then ideally acceptance. And not everyone goes through all 5 of these stages, but they are pretty well documented. Really funny, like little like skit. If you click on that in the slides, I think I have it in the lecture as well, related to these 5 different stages that we go through. So we have gone through our journey of all the way from prenatal to kind of facing the end of life. Don't forget, as always, to read chapter 11 in the ebook, right, in the Psyched book. Don't forget to read through the lecture, click on all the links, explore anything that I give you, watch any videos. That'll probably be really helpful for understanding this. And then I will see you all for our next one, which is chapter 12.